In this module, we're going to begin to take a look at the demand for labor as we consider why do different workers receive different wages. So we'll begin by taking a look at the short and long run decisions that firms make with respect to labor. We'll look at the marginality concepts once again, just to give us a brief reminder so that we can then consider the downward nature of labor, the downward sloping nature of labor demand curves. We'll consider then the determinants of labor demand. We'll consider the shifts in and movement along demand curves. And finally, we'll take a brief look at the behavior of profit maximizing firms. So let's first consider short and long run decisions that firms make. Firms make lots of decisions, of course, but some of them can be grouped into short run decisions and some can be grouped into long run decisions, which are especially important when it comes to the labor market. The first group of decisions the firm has to make, though, is what to produce, and then it has to decide how many units to produce or how much to produce, and from there it decides the quantity of the inputs to use in production. Those two decisions, how much to produce and the quantity of inputs to use in production, are largely a function of the capital and technology that the firm has available to it. Then we'll finally take a brief look at how to distribute that which is produced. And this is less about how to distribute the goods that it's producing than it is how to distribute the results of producing those goods, which we would hope to be profits. They might be losses or possibly even just break even, but we would hope them to be profits. So first, let's consider the constraints that firms have on them. Let's suppose for a moment that our firm is existing in a competitive market, not only for the good that's being produced, but also for the goods or inputs that are being used in production. So this would mean we have a competitive market for the goods market, and we have a competitive market for the factor or input markets. To consider this, we need to think about what these look like graphically. So let's consider first the retail price of the good and determine and see what we can think of or what we can say about the firm's role in setting that retail price of the good. First of all, we have a marketplace, of course. We suppose that if this is a competitive market, there are numerous producers of this good, and there is some supply represented by those producers. And there's some demand for the good represented by the market of consumers. And we know that this is going to yield some P star and some Q star. Well, one of the things that we have to remember are some governing dynamics for private goods in a competitive marketplace. And one of those dynamics has to do with price. And the first thing we have to think here is the price that one consumer pays for the good is going to be equal to the price that another consumer pays. That's going to be equal to the price that any consumer pays, which is going to be equal to P star. So in other words, not only are consumers price takers, but firms are price takers as well. Neither of them are setting the price of the good being produced and being consumed. Now this market, this organic market that's arisen with the endogenous relationships of supply and demand, has set by its confluence some price at which quantity applied equals quantity demand. We understand that. Well, let's think about that quantity for a moment. If the price that one pays is equal to the price another pays is equal to the price the nth person pays, and that's just equal to the price or P star, what's the relationship with Q star here? Well, in Q star, let's think about this from the firm. The quantity one firm produces plus the quantity a second firm produces plus the quantity that the nth firm produces is Q star. So that's the entire quantity or quantity supplied. Now we could look at this from the demand side as well. We could say the quantity that one consumer purchases plus the quantity another consumer purchases plus the quantity that all consumers purchase will be the quantity supplied. And you notice that I changed those equal signs to plus signs. They should have been plus signs all along. So this Q1 plus Q2 ... plus Qn equals Q star is true for both the consumer part of the marketplace as well as the producer part of the marketplace. Well, let's think about this in terms of what the firm or producer sees then when they're considering this, this price of the good. Well, we're going to, again, look at your basic supply and demand, or at least we're going to start looking at this. But from the firm's standpoint, the price that the firm is able to get for this good, the P star, becomes its marginal revenue. And we have to think of that as being flat, because regardless of the quantity of units, the firm is going to simply be able to get P star, whatever the price is, the going price in the market, because there are numerous firms that are selling this good. But we recognize that that does equal to P star. Well, that's marginal revenue, and we know from microeconomics that a firm will choose to produce at a point that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we think about what marginal cost might look like, perhaps something like this. And we know then in this case that this firm's marginal cost structure, where it meets the price or marginal revenue, is going to yield some Q that this particular firm will manufacture. So this is going to give us something about the relationship of how the firm sets the quantity that it produces. It doesn't set the price, it's a price taker. But it might set something about the quantity with respect to this marginal revenue and this marginal cost. Well, with respect to the goods that are being used to produce, the factor input goods that are being used in production, we have a somewhat similar story. Think about this again. We have the market for those goods. Let's say that this good is labor, since this is a labor economics course. And we know we have a wage, the price of labor. We have some labor units. We have some labor supply. Labor supply is supplied by households. Some labor demand. Labor is demanded by firms. And for whatever the type of worker this is, let's say these are production workers, there's going to be some W star and some L star. And because there are numerous workers in this marketplace and numerous purchasers of labor in this marketplace, we're going to have some of the same dynamics that we had. The wage that one worker gets is going to be equal to the wage that another worker gets, equal to the wage that the nth worker gets, and that's going to be equal to W star. Similarly, for a firm, the labor units a firm needs, plus the labor units the next firm needs, plus the labor units that the nth firm needs is going to be equal to L star. And we could say this same thing for the consumer, but in this case, of course, the consumer is the firm. So this is the market for the worker, let's say, and let's say this is a low-skilled production worker going to be working on a production line. There are likely many, many of them in the market. There's always some supply of them, so that means that unemployment is never zero. In real sense, we know that there's frictional and structural unemployment that give us some natural rate of unemployment, so unemployment is never really zero. And so this is the market that the firm faces, so it's going to pay W star regardless of how many workers it needs, and it's going to pay W star regardless of other characteristics that this firm has. So in terms of the firm itself, we look at it like this. We consider the number of labor units demanded. We consider this wage, or it's some currency denominated value. And we know the firm has a demand that's downward sloping. We'll call this labor demand, but we also have to remember that this is marginal revenue product of labor. And we'll think of this wage as being some marginal expense of labor. And so as far as the firm is concerned, once again, it's a price taker, and it will set the number of workers that it hires, but it won't set the wage. It doesn't, and this is the basis of its short-run decisions. Let's consider this a little bit further. Let's think about what kinds of long-run decisions the firm makes. Well, the firm makes decisions with respect to capital. These are long runs, of course. The firm makes decisions in the long run with respect to contracts. the firm makes decisions in respect to technology. Let's think about these three. If we're thinking about the firm, capital will be the land, the equipment, the buildings, the warehouses, the trucks, the manufacturing facilities, and these are long-term decisions. The firm can't simply decide overnight to move into a new building and start up a new manufacturing process. It takes time to do these things. Money needs to be raised, permits need to be developed, plans need to be laid, architectural, mechanical, etc. designs need to be recognized, and these can be thought of in terms of both capital that are physical, capital of financial, capital that are technological. So, and all of these have to do with some level of contract in the marketplace, of course, but other things that might have to do with contracts will be raw materials. Let's assume for a moment that we're manufacturing shoes, and we know we're planning to manufacture 1 million pairs of shoes this year. It's going to take so much cardboard, so much rubber, so much fabric, so much leather, etc., so much labor, and we're going to need certain types of equipment. Well, we'll contract for all of these, with the possible exception of labor, which we may not have to contract for in our production initially. But even if we think about the raw materials, we'll probably contract for these in order to get a better price. If I know I'm going to make 1 million pairs of shoes, and let's say that's going to cost me 1 million pounds of leather, if that's how it's sold, then rather than go out and buy a pound or 100 pounds at a time in the open market on any given day, I'm going to go ahead and contract with a leather producer and agree to a better price perhaps from that producer in exchange for this contract to purchase this 1 million pounds. In that case, some of my raw materials might end up being a long-term decision, and some of them might be a shorter-term decision. And we'll kind of take those apart in a few moments. So in the long run, firms make many, many choices, and those choices really only include labor if there are labor contracts. And a labor contract might be if you're hiring a CEO and they want to know that they're going to be with the firm long enough to make a difference, they may want a contract. Labor unions are going to deal with contracts. By and large, we don't think of production workers as being on contract, because if a production worker is on a contract, then the market for that lower skilled production worker isn't a competitive market. That contract exists as an exogenous influence which has upset that supply and demand relationship that we're trying to think about. Well, when it comes to short-term then, of course, firms can make short-term decisions with respect to one element pretty consistently, and that is labor. And we noted a few moments ago when we took a look at this decision for the firm, that the firm decides how many labor units to acquire based upon the marginal productivity of labor in that firm, which is going to have something to do with the capital that firm employs, the working environment, the equipment, the technology, but also with respect to the marginal expense of that labor, which is simply going to be its wage in a competitive market. So in the short term, the firm's decisions have to do with labor and pretty much only labor. However, we're going to see that there's a relationship that will develop which we'll think of as a balance condition. And this balance condition is a profit maximizing condition. It says we want to consider a point at which the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor becomes equal to the marginal product of capital, or any other inputs or all other inputs, divided by the price of capital, just as one of the types of inputs. And we'll think of this as being all inputs. So here we've got all of our inputs combined. We've got the marginal product of labor as an input divided by the price of labor. And we want that to equal the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And that gives us a balance condition. With that balance condition having been met, then we know that we're using our capital efficiently, we know that we're using our labor efficiently. But what happens if instead of this being equal, what happens if the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor is less than the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital? Well, we can't change the number of capital units easily. Remember, we said that capital takes some time to make changes. I can't just go out and decide to move into a new building overnight. I can't decide to change my $5 million of production equipment overnight. These takes time. And in order to change the marginal product of capital, I need to change the number of units of capital that I'm using. Recall in our marginality discussion that we said that as we use more units of an input, capital being an input in this case, that the marginal productivity of that input goes down. So if we have this relationship, we can't bring this back into equality by changing the price of labor because we are price takers if we're firms. We can't change the price of capital. Again, we're price takers. We can't really in the short run change the marginal productivity of the capital or marginal product capital in our environment based upon bringing in new capital units or taking old capital units out. The only thing really that we can change is our labor units. We can choose to employ more or less labor units, in which case we know that employing more will reduce our marginal product of labor. Employing fewer will increase our marginal product of labor. Well, if the left-hand value is less than the greater or than the right-hand value, we want to make the left-hand value larger, so we want to increase the marginal product of capital, or excuse me, marginal product of labor value, and we're going to do that by increasing, or rather decreasing, the number of labor units. So as we have fewer labor units, the marginal product of labor is going to go up, and that might bring this back into balance. We can also think about these short and long run cost decisions or input decisions that we make as a firm based upon fixed costs and variable costs. Recall for a moment that a firm has some total revenue minus total cost to equal some profit. And we know that total revenue is equal to the price of the goods sold times the quantity of the goods being sold. We know that total cost is going to be equal to the fixed costs of the firm plus the variable costs of the firm. And we're also going to recall that in our fixed costs, there's going to be the opportunity cost of the investor's time and capital. Now, it's not the only thing there. In fixed costs, we're going to have our costs of other capital. We're going to have much of our overhead or admin cost. We're going to have some of our tax structure, regulatory structure, permit structure, etc. And all of these are costs that whether we manufacture 1 unit or 1,000,000 units of the good, these costs are not going to change. So these are fixed costs. And variable costs then would be costs that we would associate with production. A variable cost will include the production labor, might include some of our inputs that we're using, such as our raw materials and such, if we've not expressly contracted for those, depending upon how we look at them. But we can think about this in terms of fixed and variable costs as well. Remember, though, that in fixed costs, we're always including the opportunity cost since we're looking at this as economists.